Okay, time for our last lecture in Unit 3 on the judiciary. So this is the third lecture on the three branches of the government, or what I would consider the institutions of the government. So we talked about the legislative branch of Congress, and then we also had a lecture on the presidency. So this is the third branch, the judiciary. So we'll talk a little bit about the structure of the judiciary, a little bit about how the court works, and then at the end we'll talk about the Marbury v. Madison case and how the Supreme Court got the power to declare laws unconstitutional. So thinking of the Constitution, only the Supreme Court is explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Talks about a nomination process. So justices to the Supreme Court and other federal courts are nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. And so all these justices serve for life, sort of during quote unquote good behavior. So it's possible to impeach a member of the Supreme Court or anyone in the federal judiciary. And there's been a couple examples. One of my sort of favorite examples of an impeached judge was Elsie Hastings was impeached as a judge. He's from Florida. And then so after that happened, what did he do? He ran for Congress and he won. So I guess life isn't over. If you get impeached as a judge, you can serve in another branch. So yeah, the Supreme Court really, or the Constitution really only talks about the Supreme Court and then says the Congress can sort of determine the shape and scope of the federal judiciary through legislation. When we talk about Marbury v. Madison, we'll talk about the first judiciary, or maybe the second Judiciary Act, I think. But this is something that's being debated now as I record this lecture is, what's Vice President Biden's stance on enlarging the Supreme Court? So the Constitution doesn't say how many members there should be on the Supreme Court or any court for that matter. It doesn't say that it needs to be an odd number. Really just says the president will nominate justices and then they have to be approved by the Senate. And then over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen the threshold needed to confirm justices go down from and this is not based off of the Constitution, but based off how the Senate operates. So it was judicial nominees could be filibustered, and then under Harry Reid as majority leader, the Democrats lowered the threshold to a simple majority on nominations other than Supreme Court nominees. And then under Mitch McConnell and President Trump, they lowered it for Supreme Court nominees. So judicial nominees now only need a majority approval rather than a supermajority or the 60 votes. And again, sort of just summarize here, like the Constitution allows changes in the structure of the court. We have a tradition of having 9 justices on the Supreme Court, but it hasn't always been that way. I think there were 6. At times there's been 8. There's only 8 now. It's been 7. So it has varied over time, although it's been pretty consistent at 9, except when there's a vacancy for quite a while. And then FDR, of course, had his court packing plan where he was going to increase the size of the court because the court wasn't ruling in his favor and didn't have to follow through with that because the court basically came his way a little bit. So I said, yeah, the founders left it to Congress to design the judiciary. And originally, I think the thinking is most of the judicial actions in the US would be at the state level. And that's actually probably still true today. But the founders, they left it to Congress. And some of the original judiciary acts, they actually had the Supreme Court justices would do what's called riding circuit. And so they divided the country up into circuits. And so a member of the Supreme Court and then some members of the lower courts would go around to different parts of the country and decide cases then. And then if things got appealed or maybe something in the original jurisdiction, the Supreme Court itself would meet as well. The justices of the Supreme Court did not like riding circuit. It was a lot of work. You're not staying in nice places. So that was changed relatively quickly. So yeah, the first Judiciary Act was 1789, which is one of the first things the Congress did. And so it sort of gave the court certain powers over what kinds of cases they would hear, and set up these circuit courts that were divided around the country. So thinking about appointments, this is something that people are interested in now, and I guess always interested in. So this is the current court, with the exception, of course, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who recently died. So the justices in red were appointed by Republican presidents, and the justices in blue were appointed by Democratic presidents. So you see, even with having Ruth Bader Ginsburg in here, the Republicans had the opportunity to appoint 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 justices, and then the replacement for Ginsburg will be a sixth. And then there's 4, and then it'll be down to 3 appointments by Democratic presidents. Now, the presidents nominate the justices and confirmed by the Senate or not. In the case of Obama, had an appointment that didn't get a vote. So the Senate doesn't have to confirm if they don't want to. They don't even have to hold a vote. They could vote no. And if people are upset with that, the answer to that is to vote the people out of office who made that move. I should come back and say, just because a Democratic president appoints a justice, it doesn't mean that person has to rule in a liberal fashion. In fact, some of the appointments made by, I think, Reagan ended up sort of, moving a little bit, in some cases a lot, to the left over the course of their career. So, people think now, Justice Roberts is, in some cases, is probably more moderate than they thought, given appointed by George Bush. But yeah, there's nothing that really holds these justices. Once they're on the court, they can do whatever they want. So you have to be very careful in the pick, hoping you get the rulings that you want. So this is a little bit of the ideology of the justices. So with the justices on the left, and again, Ginsburg is there, and are the liberal justices, and they were appointed by Democrats. And then the justices on the right are the more conservative justices, and they were appointed by Republicans. So Kavanaugh and Thomas are the most conservative, and Sotomayor and Ginsburg, they were sort of they made up the strong part of the left on the bench. So with 9 justices, you want a majority you need a majority to rule in your favor. I should say, if there's a tie, so currently there's 8 justices, if there's a 4-4 vote by the court, then the status quo holds. So whatever the ruling was below the Supreme Court, that's the one that is enforced if there's a tie on the bench. So yeah, Roberts, when Ginsburg was on the bench, was what we would call like the median justice. So think back to the median voter lecture that we had. You can think of Roberts as the median justice. So this next slide, again, sort of we're looking at ideology here. You can compare where Amy Coney Barrett, who's the nominee, is relative to who she's replacing, which is Ginsburg, right? So, and these scores are based off of how they vote in certain cases. There's probably a little wiggle room in here because Coney Barrett obviously isn't on the court, but she has a record of, she's a judge now, just not on the Supreme Court. So that's the record that they're using here. But there's no doubt that she's conservative, especially relative to Ginsburg. So, we'll be replacing liberal justice in Ginsburg with the much more conservative one in Coney Barrett, and that means the court's going to rule in a more liberal or conservative fashion. And so, since the justices serve for life, what you end up with is an instance where the Supreme Court, so we'll have a conservative Supreme Court. There's a good chance we'll have Biden as president, and the Democrats control the Senate. So Supreme Court and the other 2 branches of the government are going to be perhaps at odds in terms of ideology. It's a little bit by design, right? We talked about in the Congress lecture about the president and the members of Congress are elected separately. So what you don't want is sort of like the whims of the people. I get this is the idea. Very quickly pushing policy in one direction or another. Having justices for life, will also push back against that. At the same time, you end up with a court that is like very out of step with the public. So there's people have had ideas about what to do. So one, a relatively simple one, I guess, is to add more justices to the court. And this could be done through legislation. So again, if we have a whole Democratic Congress and presidency, by passing a law, they can just say, hey, let's add more justices. And then they would have to go through confirmation, of course, but that would allow the Democrats, Biden, to appoint and confirm more liberal justices to try to strike a balance. There's been other ideas that might actually require constitutional amendments. That would be having term limits on the justices, maybe 15 years, right? The idea is if you don't have to stand for election, you serve for life, you're not going to fall for like political or pressure, right, from outside, because you're not going to lose your job. So that's one idea about having term limits, although you're not up for election. So you're going to lose your job and it at a certain period of time. So yeah, term limits. I've seen even more different, I guess, ideas. You could have a larger body of justices, and then you kind of randomly draw some to rule on a certain case or something like that. So there's lots of things you could do to change the courts. I don't really have an opinion on it, but those are just some options that have been floated around. Okay, so a little bit about the judiciary, and here, for the most part, we're just talking about the federal judiciary. The state court system has some similarities, but lots of differences. So there's similarities in that there tends to be sort of this pyramid, this layer of courts, going from the bottom up to the top, but there's other things that are different. So the Supreme Court, or the federal judiciary has 3 layers. There's a couple of courts that are kind of in the layer, but not really. And those are there's a tax court, I think, although that's below the Supreme Court still. But anyways, so 3 layers. The base are the district courts. So there's 94 district courts staffed by 632 justices. Every state has 1. The big states, California, Texas, and I guess Florida have 4. States in between might have 2. And they're staffed with justices that have to be confirmed, and they serve for life. So it's very similar to the Supreme Court that we're probably a little more familiar with. The trial courts, they deal with criminal and civil cases. So are generally 2 types of cases. Above that are courts of appeal. So there's 13 courts of appeals with 179 judges who sit in these panels. And so these 3-judge panels. And these courts are arranged in regional circuits. And I'll show a map in a second of where the circuits are. But the fact that they sit in these panels is similar to, thinking about the Supreme Court, that, if you want a more liberal ruling, you might hope for, at least 2 liberal justices on the, or judges on the panel court. Or if you want conservative rulings, at least 2 conservative judges. And again, these judges serve for life. And so this is why there was so much fighting over approving and nominating and confirming the judges, even at these lower levels. Again, they're there for life. And then most of the cases are only heard at this level. Very few of the cases are heard at the Supreme Court level. So it's these lower courts that we talk less about that are making the majority of the rulings that are the ones that count. So here's our circuits. Oklahoma is here in the 10th Circuit. California and the West Coast states are in the 9th Circuit. You can sort of look and see where the different circuits are. I guess they kind of make sense, the states that they're with. So something to think about in terms of these circuits is you can do a little bit of venue shopping on a case. So if you're trying to have, I don't know, a case that would apply everywhere, and you want to get a more liberal ruling. So I should back up and say the 9th Circuit tends to be a bit more liberal because there's a tradition of appointing judges to a circuit who are from that area. right? So if it's a court in California, you're probably going to have a judge that's from California. And then there was a tradition, it's kind of gone away a little bit, of the senators from those states also have a large say in who holds those positions. So anyways, what you end up with is, the Ninth Circuit here on the West Coast tends to be fairly liberal compared to maybe, the Fifth Circuit here down in Texas, or the 11th Circuit, that's Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. So you had a case that you wanted to get say you want to get a more liberal ruling, you would try to bring it in the Ninth Circuit. Now, the event or whatever it is that you're appealing has to have happened there. So I give an example. People like to challenge, like, can you say the Pledge of Allegiance in schools, right? It says under God, can you force someone to do this, that kind of thing. So in a ruling against the Pledge of Allegiance would probably be a liberal ruling. So where do you bring that case? You bring it in the Ninth Circuit. And how do you do that? Well, they say the Pledge of Allegiance everywhere, right? Across all the states. So you just take some school in the Ninth Circuit and say, like, well, this is where we're going to try to challenge that. On the flip side, maybe if you want a conservative ruling, like maybe the case is on abortion, and you want to restrict abortion, you might bring the case in the 11th Circuit, right? So abortion happens, in all 50 states. So you could bring that case, take an example from the 11th Circuit. So you can shop a little bit on the appeals or the circuits. Oops. Okay, so the Supreme Court is at the top. It's the final court of appeal. The rulings by the Supreme Court are final unless a similar case is heard by the court later. So the Supreme Court generally hears appeals. I'll talk in a second about original jurisdiction, but an appeal is there was a ruling below, and then they didn't like the ruling, so they're going to appeal that ruling to a higher court. The Supreme Court has to agree to hear the case. This is called granting cert. I have a bullet point somewhere about this, but so 4 of the 9 justices have to agree to hear it to grant cert. So yeah, it has to be appealed up from a federal court, or can actually be appealed, and I have a slide on this too, from state courts. And usually it's when it's a constitutional question is in dispute, right? So the Supreme Court doesn't decide things like guilty or innocent, right? It's usually a part of the case that they hear that has a constitutional question in it. So the McGirt case had a constitutional question in it, so the McGirt case was originally, part of it was criminal, but the Supreme Court dealt with, where could a case like this be held, right? Who had jurisdiction in this particular area, which is not. So it had an outcome on the guilt or innocent, or guilty or not guilty, of someone in the case. But the thing the Supreme Court ruled on was about, who has jurisdiction in that particular area. The other thing about Supreme Court cases is, like, their ruling is usually well after the actual event. So, the example I give is, affirmative action in Texas is one, where I think it was Fisher v. Texas, I think was the affirmative action case. And this is sort of affirmative action in higher education. And so Fisher, I think, was not admitted to the University of Texas. So the Texas system has, if you're in the top some percent of your class, you automatically get into some of the Texas schools, the state schools. And then the rest are like, there's sort of you're scored somehow. And there's an affirmative action, or if you're from an underrepresented group, you would get scored higher. Now, Fisher sues, saying, like, well, I'm a better applicant than someone else, and the only difference is based off of her race. So she sues, and it takes a long time for the case to make it to the Supreme Court. And in the meantime, she's like, well, I'm going to go to college. So I think she goes to school in Louisiana or something. So she ends up, going to school, and she graduates. I think she's graduated before the court even gives a ruling. So the court is very slow to make it to the Supreme Court. There's another case where, someone got suspended in high school for something that they did, And, you know, the Supreme Court actually ends up ruling on this. It's the Bong Hits for Jesus case. You can look it up if you want. But obviously the person like already served their week-long suspension in school before the Supreme Court. I think the person actually even like graduated from high school before the court heard the case. Okay, so yeah, I talked about this granting cert. 4 of 9 justices have to agree to hear the case. There is an original jurisdiction for the Supreme Court, and that's if it's affecting ambassadors, sort of this international part to it, and then if it's a state versus another state. So I think there was a case, I think this made it to Supreme Court, where Georgia and Tennessee had a dispute over where the border was. This actually was recent. You think they would have worked this out by now, but they had a dispute where the border was, and that kind of thing would be something the Supreme Court would handle. So a state versus another state. So this is sort of the order. You got your district courts and your courts of appeals on the federal side. And then on the other side, you'd have state courts and maybe an appellate court in the state and the state Supreme Court. So if things get appealed, they can make it up to the top to the Supreme Court. So there's kind of 2 different paths. One's the state path and one is the federal path. So something to think about is the Supreme Court can't force the lower level courts to rule in a particular way. Now, so if a case is with a court below the Supreme Court like, doesn't really signal, especially if it's an area that really hasn't been decided yet. So the judges at these lower courts can rule however they want. And so, and lots of the cases actually end up the last time they're heard is at these lower level courts. So you can't, there is a hierarchy here, but the hierarchy only really comes into a play if the case gets appealed up to the top level. So now if there's like a pretty clear precedent on a case and a lower court rules against the precedent, you know, someone who's part of that case can appeal it to the Supreme Court and they'll likely get the correct ruling. Assuming the court again agrees to hear this. So anyways, it's you can't force judges to rule in a certain fashion just because there is a hierarchy, right? And so the same thing, the judges serve for life, and I talk about this geography mattering. This is sort of the circuit shopping. I talked about the Pledge of Allegiance, maybe an abortion case. You know, if a lower level court rules in a way that the Supreme Court might want to rule differently. So again, they have to agree to hear it, but a litigant also has to agree to appeal it to the higher court. So they can't, the Supreme Court can't, like, oh, that's an interesting case, reach down and say, we're going to hear this. Someone has to appeal it up to the court. Another problem with the court is it can have trouble enforcing its decisions in the lower courts. And so I give an example, is Brown v. Board of Education. So Brown v. Board of Education was 54. It wasn't really until almost a decade later, when the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that schools started to desegregate. And so there's no like enforcement mechanism by the court. There's no police. There's no money they can threaten to withhold. There's no like Supreme Court army that can enforce the cases. You're sort of just hoping that you're at the whims of either the courts or whatever the body that's enforcing these laws, which would be some cases the executive branch, but speaking of education, like it's really like a state court, right? Or it's at the state level, or it could be at the local level. So it can be potentially difficult to enforce decisions if people really are against them. And then, you know, thinking about Brown v. Board, at the local level, places did all sorts of things. They said, well, we're going to make private academies, and so, you know, there's lots of ways to get around this ruling. And it really wasn't, again, until the federal government passed a law that said that, you know, we're going to withhold funds or other things if the schools don't desegregate. And I said this a couple of times that, you know, the Supreme Court hears a limited number of cases, so maybe 100, 150 out of 7,000, right? So, you know, most cases, the final ruling is at a lower level. Okay, so we'll talk about judicial review, right? If I said, like, what does the Supreme Court do? Most of you would say the Supreme Court declares laws unconstitutional or constitutional, and that's mostly right. But this was not explicit in the Constitution. There's not a line in the Constitution that says the Supreme Court, its main job is to rule on the constitutionality of cases. It just says it's going to be the highest court. Now, if you look back and look at some of the debates at the Constitutional Convention, this is something that was, I don't want to say assumed, but like it came up, but it was never explicit in the Constitution. So it's something the courts had to sort of take on their own. Okay, so there's a little bit of backstory to this. So the Federalist Party, John Adams and his party, so Adams loses the presidential election to Thomas Jefferson. The Congress also loses the Federalist majority to the Jefferson. You can think of the Jefferson Party, sometimes the Anti-Federalists, sometimes called the Democratic Republican Party. So there's a couple different ways to name that party. So anyways, the Federalists lose, and the other party is coming into power. But the way this is still true today, but back then, there was actually an extremely long time between the election and when the president takes over, the next president, and even until the next Congress starts to. So there's we would call it lame duck. There's a very long lame duck period. This was eventually changed. Now we can have a shorter lame duck period now, but there still is time. So, okay, so Jefferson, the incoming party, his term doesn't start until March of 1801, and this is the election of 1800. So there's a significant amount of time once we know the results, but before Jefferson and his party comes in. So what does Adams do? Nominates a number of Federalists to positions in the court. So he nominates John Marshall to the Supreme Court. So there was Marshall is nominated and approved. So he gets on the Supreme Court. And then what else they did is the lame duck Federalists, they passed another Judiciary Act, and they increased the number of courts, right? These district and appeals courts. And so that gave them the opportunity to appoint, nominate and have confirmed a number of justices. They basically could flood the court with Federalist judges. And this was perfectly legal. The question in this Marbury v. Madison case we're going to talk about is not about the Judiciary Act, although it comes up, but this was seen as legal. There were questions of Adams thought can we just shrink the bench and get rid of, or Jefferson later thinks about, can we just get rid of these judges? But anyways, Adams, so again, the outgoing Federalist, John Adams, appoints Federalist Marbury judge for one of these positions. So he's one of the things, but there ends up being a slip up in the bureaucracy where the outgoing Secretary of State, who's actually John Marshall, who gets appointed to the bench, forgets to do something. We'll get to that. Okay. So Jefferson and Democratic Republicans, they respond, they won't withdraw some of the appointments and repealing the law. So this is sort of can they do this? So there's a couple cases we'll talk about. One is important, but is actually not the Marbury case. We spent more time on the Marbury case, but the Stewart case, and this was actually 2 years later, right? So 1803, talk about how the court is slow. The court says Congress can do that. It's actually pretty clear in the Constitution. So this is saying a law is constitutional. So this is really one of the first times the court says if a law is constitutional or not. In this case, they say it is constitutional. So this is a Stewart case, sort of giving precedent for saying laws are constitutional, saying the Judiciary Act is constitutional. And this was probably thinking of if the Democrats, again, sort of take all the presidency in the Congress and want to pass a Judiciary Act of 2021 or something, people will say it's not constitutional. And this is the precedent that says it is. So you can impress people with your, actually the Stewart case says from 1803. Okay, but the Marbury v. Madison case, this is, I don't know, the more famous case, where John Marshall, who is now the Chief Justice and is on the Supreme Court, talks about and gives the power of declaring laws unconstitutional. Okay, so again, who are the important people here? There's William Marbury. He is appointed a Justice of the Peace position by Adams, but former Secretary of State and now the Chief Justice who's ruling on this case, John Marshall, he didn't deliver the commission. So essentially he made a mistake in the bureaucracy and didn't do something. So sort of as an aside here, Marshall is clearly a player in the case, right? So now Chief Justice John Marshall is ruling on something that he didn't do in a different position. So like he really should recuse himself, right? Because he's not a part of the case, but he's sort of part of it, if that makes sense. So he's not a litigant the way Marbury is, or Madison is, but he's certainly like part of the case. So I think he should recuse himself. Okay, so the Secretary of State forgets to do something through the bureaucracy. So there's a question of like, should Marbury still get this position? So what happens? Marbury, he sues to force current Secretary of State James Madison, also goes on to be president, to deliver the commissions. He's like, well, it's not really my fault, right? So what Marbury does is he asks the court to use what's called a writ of mandamus. And this writ of mandamus is a judicial instruction to the government. So it's saying, Marbury is saying, Supreme Court, you should tell the Congress or the executive branch, you need to do something. So that trying to force the hand through this writ of mandamus. So a judicial instruction to the government. And this was a power that was given to the court by the Judiciary Act, right? So there was a law that was written that said the Supreme Court can tell other parts of the government what to do. So in this case, Chief Justice Marshall, he says that, okay, Madison should have delivered the commission, but this idea that the court can have these writs of mandamus was a part of the first Judiciary Act, was unconstitutional. Saying this is not a power that the court should have. The Supreme Court, or the federal courts, cannot force the other branches of Congress to act. So these writs of mandamus, that was power given to the Supreme Court by the Judiciary Act, Marshall says it's unconstitutional. So this is the first time they're declaring part of a law unconstitutional. So the Laird case says a part is constitutional. This Marbury v. Madison case says part of the Judiciary Act is unconstitutional. Again, it doesn't throw out the whole act, it only throws out part of the act. So it sets the precedent, and precedent is important in the law for judicial review. So from here on out, the court has the ability to declare laws constitutional or unconstitutional because they have this precedent that they gave to themselves. So the reason this is like a good ruling is, in a way, in the short term, it looks like a win for Madison and Jefferson, because Marbury is not allowed to be on the bench, right? It says, nope, there's nothing we can do about this. Like, the government made a mistake, but we can't force the government to act. So again, looks like a win because this Federalist Marbury doesn't get his position. So the court and the government don't have to do anything. But what it does is it gives the court this ability to declare laws constitutional. So this is a quote, is empathetically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. So you get some times where like the Supreme Court rules and someone says like, well, that's not right. That's the wrong ruling. Well, but it is the ruling. The Supreme Court gets the last say on what is the law. Sort of the last say. I should be careful there. The Supreme Court gets the last say on the constitutionality of a law. So we could have a couple things happen after that. One, the Congress can pass a new law that is constitutional, right? That maybe corrects the mistakes that were made, or the Supreme Court can hear a similar case on the same topic and have a different ruling. So maybe it's also potentially a short-term win. The ability to declare laws, the precedent to declare laws unconstitutional came out in this case in 1803, but actually wasn't used a lot. It wasn't until the 20th century that it was used much more. So just sort of the last slide, bonus slide here to sum up the three branches of government. So a way to think about the three branches of government are separate institutions that share power. So what that means is in some cases, they need the other branch to act for something to happen, right? So like Congress passing a law needs the president to either sign it or veto. Or president nominates someone, it needs the Senate to confirm that nomination. So this sets up this idea of checks and balances. So the different institutions, so separate institutions sharing power, they can also check each other. So Congress has the ability to check the president, right? So Congress writes laws, they can override a veto, right? The president doesn't write laws. They can check Congress with a veto, but can't write laws, only Congress can. Congress checks the courts by voting on nominees. It can change the jurisdiction or size of the courts. And then the Congress also plays a role in can play a role in constitutional amendments that could also change the court. Or the court could declare a law unconstitutional. And the Congress could say, like, let's change the Constitution. And the Congress can do that. Of course, we have our, we need both stages, the writing of the amendment and the ratification of the amendment at the state level or at the state level. So we can kind of go back and forth here. The president checks the Congress with a veto, checks the courts with nomination, and the court sort of checks both. It can declare laws and also like executive orders or other actions by the president as unconstitutional. So this would make a great question, talk about how, you know, the three branches of the government can check each other. So that's the end of Unit 3, the end of mostly talking about the three branches or the institutions of government.